Oh, good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, but please be very kind in your questioning at the end. This is the title of my PhD proposal. It's quite long there. That's the proper title. The short one is Urban Forest Regulation. It's about increasing urban forest on private land. And I'm proposing a mixed methods investigation of regulatory mechanisms in Australia. There's me and my two supervisors are Ram Pandit, who's here, and Alex Gardner, who has joined us online. I'm not sure. He has, yes.
Yes, he has.
Okay. Hi, Alex. Thank you for coming. Right. So let's get one. There we go. So background. Draw your attention to the asterisk there. Most people live in urban areas. Urban areas are negatively impacted by twin emergencies, climate change and biodiversity loss. The value of urban forest in addressing these environmental issues and a number of related issues is very well known. Those are the benefits in a very short summary in the top box there. We've got urban heat island mitigation, that's cooling effects, stormwater filtration, air filtration, carbon dioxide absorption, carbon storage, increased land value, thank you, Ram, and support for biodiversity, reduced building energy consumption, and improved human mental and physical well-being. Urban forest can be described as essentially all vegetation in urban areas, regardless of tenure, meaning it covers private land as well as Crown land or public land. One key development which has happened in recent times is the advent of iTree and similar software becoming available for free use. This supports canopy measuring, and in Australia, a lot of local governments who are generally responsible for planning of urban forest have taken this up and developing strategies and setting targets because they can now measure how they're going to protect and to increase urban forest. So I've just got a couple of pictures there to show you. This can include vertical and also you've got sort of street trees, garden trees and so on.
We'll just minimize this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry, Dave, you were part of my slide there. So there is a problem though. So local governments across Australia have really made a lot of effort to increase and expand the canopy, but the measuring is showing that it's only slightly increasing, and in some cases it's continuing to decline despite these efforts. And the research that's coming out now is indicating that this is due to continued on the private land side. Private land tends to make up about 80% of the urban land area. So you can see how if you've got 80% of the land area declining and the local governments can do a lot on the 20% that remains, there's still going to be an overall decline. And development on private land, it's a primary cause. This is according to research which is mostly done about from discussions with planning officers. But it's also linked to canopy loss in the surrounding public land area due to when a development happens, there's underground infrastructure needs to go in, soil compaction and construction access. So when a development happens, it's not just the trees on the land that are lost, but also the trees surrounding that development land. And there was a study done, so this one just shows a bit of visual. It was Melbourne, City of Melbourne, 2008 to 2016. Now, they haven't put parks in here, so they've just looked at streets and private property. And then you've got the DAM, which is Development Activity Monitor. So what you've got here is your street trees, and the black line is your net increase or decline. So you've got a net increase in street trees. And then you've got private property, which the net decrease is there at 4.5, and you've also got, when you're looking at is it to do with development, well, it clearly is, because most of that is to do with development. But on the public side with the street trees, you've also got that evidence that some of the decline is due to development as well. So this is just a visual to show you what people are discovering is happening. So what can we do? What can local governments do to stop this canopy loss on private land? Well, they have planning controls. So these are set out in planning laws and regulations, which are activated upon instigation of a development application. Planning law and its application to urban forest on private land. So researchers have started looking into this, but it's very difficult. Each state's legislation is different. Each local government area's scheme and policies are different. Every individual provision of tree protection is associated with its own set of, and planning law in Australia is notoriously complex. This is a quote from a Supreme Court judge in the Tasmanian Supreme Court, who was trying to come to grips with the planning scheme that in a case that had come before him. He says the planning scheme is very complex, exceedingly and unnecessarily difficult to comprehend or interpret. Most ordinary people would not have a chance. Most sensible people or people with a life would not attempt the task unless they had absolutely no choice. In order to determine how the scheme operates in relation to the appellant's proposed development, it is practically essential to have a law degree, decades of experience in interpreting legal documents, a talent for understanding gobbledygook and misused words, a lot of time, and a very strong capacity for perseverance. So this is my first task in the PhD. So that's what I'm attempting, and I imagine probably those things do apply to me. I probably have no life, and I have a talent for understanding gobbledygook. So I have a couple of the things that planning law textbooks, by the way, don't go into this level of detail about the application to urban forests. They talk about planning laws in the bigger picture. This is a scheme. This is what a local government scheme looks like. This is what regulations look like, and so on. So laws and regulations, they require enforcement to work. This little diagram, you've probably seen various versions of it. This is a sort of starts out with a swing, what the developer wanted, what the architect designed, what was priced, what the structural engineer recommended, and so on. You've got on the bottom line what the fire officer demanded, which was the lopping of the tree altogether, and then what you end up with in the very end. This is just to demonstrate that what happens in practice can be very instructive as to how to improve laws and regulations, but until you actually look at what's happening when they are actually applied in practice, you can't really get to the bottom of how to improve them. Case studies looking at actual applications of planning law on the ground allow a full understanding of the processes being examined. There's only ever been one tree retention case study undertaken in Australia. And that was about 7 or 8 years ago by a law professor from Adelaide University. And she did a job, very helpful, but it was only one. And I'm proposing to do for my second task in my PhD a selection of several case studies of development and tree loss retention on private land to look at informing recommendations for increasing canopy cover. So this is approximately how I'm going to select my case studies. I'm going to do 18 and I'm going to cover 3 states, and I'm going to look at examples of redevelopment, by which I mean so a multi-storey building goes up on a place where 4 houses previously stood. I'm going to look at infill, which is where you put a house in the backyard, and I'm going to look at greenfields, which is where you build a whole new suburb from scratch. What about increasing and improving urban forest? So planning law can slow tree loss if it's properly applied, but it does have limitations. First of all, the penalties tend not to be that strict. We could make them stricter. There's got a big smile, she knows what's coming up. So I was looking at some history of tree laws and penalties for damaging trees. I found this quote This is from tree laws, which applied in Germany about 3,000 years ago. It was documented by a Roman historian. The penalty under the old German laws for someone who dared peel the bark off a standing tree, now forgive me, this is not my wording, okay? Peel the bark of a standing tree was to have his navel cut out and nailed to the part of the tree which he had peeled, and then be driven round and round the tree until all his guts were wound about its trunk. Now, I think if we brought that in Australia, like we would prevent tree loss, instantly, I think. But I don't think the public is going to really agree with introducing a law like that. So, apart from stricter penalties, and even that wouldn't increase canopy. You can see that's not a requirement to plant. Requirements to plant require a lot of monitoring. There are some laws that do that. Again, they're only activated upon a development application usually, so you've got ad hoc. You can't do a whole landscape-wide urban forest strategy using just planning law development applications and hoping they come up at the right time in the right place. So planning laws have limited capability in respect of increasing urban forest, which means we need a new way to regulate it. Something complementary to the planning law. When I talk about regulate, I mean influencing human behaviour. I don't mean a strict regulation that says, you must pay your parking fine or whatever. Very much broader than that, about influencing human behaviour. And able to be applied to private landowners to influence the behaviours to drive an increase in urban forest. And it will need to be based on a concept that will support both site-specific application and also larger-scale urban forest strategies. And once having designed that, we need to test it for community willingness to adopt it. This is the third task in my PhD. Now, I'm just going to give you an example, and this is where I really, really want you guys to pay attention, because this is where it gets really interesting. This is not necessarily what I will look at, and I hope to come back to you when I am looking at this in more detail and have got a full proposal worked out. This is an example. This is where I think it probably will go. So baseline concept, green infrastructure. It's a multi-scale concept. It's got a focus on strategic planning. It basically covers exactly the same thing as what urban forest covers. And there's a real uptick in global usage. You can see from that chart there, that is the number of articles globally which are referencing green infrastructure from 1995 to 2019. And most of them are in relation to urban land. So green infrastructure as your base concept. Now, influencing behaviour. So my proposal is to base it on something that's very similar to successful stormwater management schemes in the US, where cities in the US are basically using green infrastructure to manage stormwater on private land. And what they're doing is introducing a property tax, which is in the US case usually based on the contribution to the problem, but in our case I would suggest introducing effectively a charge based on the rateable property value. So then once you've got your tax in place, you can apply discounts which are then based on your contribution to the solution. So the number of trees you got planted, or the amount of roof space you've converted to green roof, or whatever, that sort of thing, that you can devise the right sort of incentive and have a percentage reduction of the fee that's being charged. And that this would be implementable through the Australian rate system. And then we would test it on a relatively short closed survey about would the public be willing to adopt this new system. We would also allow, on the basis that it was a resounding no, to nominate a reason for the unwillingness so that we could actually have some kind of vague idea why not. And to cover the same LGAs as the case study research so that we can draw some comparisons between the types of laws which we'll then examine fully that apply in those LGAs, and to see, well, those are really strong laws and those people do support it, or those are weak laws and those people support it, or whatever. We might be able to draw some inferences from that information if we cover the same area. And we'll include householder characteristics for additional analysis as well. So drawing it all together, this is it in a nutshell. So I'm going to do a preparatory review at first, which is reviewing all those legal and policy mechanisms applicable in Australia. Second task is to do case studies, testing the existing mechanisms, seeing where it's going wrong. And then the third one is to come up with a new proposal which would support increase of urban forest, and to test whether that could be adopted in Australia with any success. And at the end of all of that, develop a set of recommendations for improving existing urban forest regulation in Australia. So those are just some credits for the things that I've used in there. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Emma. Question?
Thanks, Emma. So you're doing a PhD between law and economics, so you're a bit between a sort of rock and a hard place.
Yes.
Because lawyers love details, and economists are not so great at details. So I suppose integrate the two, but it strikes me that where details might be useful for an analysis is to actually look at how different councils' behaviour has led to different levels of tree cover at a fairly general level. So there's what's called a quasi-experimental method called difference in difference that you might want to have a look at. So that's where you can use the fact that a council changed its policies, say 20 years ago, look at what effect that has had on tree cover when you compare it with another council which hasn't changed policy.
Yeah.
And I'll just throw.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I wonder how you'll cope with getting Ram and Alex on the same page.
They turn up so far. They happily turn up to the meetings, with each other. So we're all good so far. Thank you. That's useful. I will give that some thought.
Yeah, we have questions from online participants. Ross, can you unmute and maybe ask your question, or shall I read it? Ross?
Shall we read it?
Yeah, okay. Then,
This one?
yeah, this one.
I know it sounds pedantic, but is definition of a tree? I ask, as developers will probably plant whatever at least cost constitutes a tree, but different sorts of trees probably generate different benefits. So don't you need a BCA framework? What's BCA?
Very costly.
Oh, no, of course, yeah. Okay, so there is actually a really interesting new approach that is developing in some of the Scandinavian countries and also in London, which I think might be able to be used for this type of this aspect, the definition of a tree, and that is to actually apply a greening factor to a range of about 20 different practical measures that you can take on urban land, whether it's green wall or like green roof. They say green roof, but grass is 0.2 or whatever. And basically they're using this in London for new developments to say that a new developer must attain a green rating under this urban greening factor of 1 or 0.8 or whatever they're saying, and then they have to do enough things that coordinate to create that amount. So I think that is something which could be used as part of this new regulatory framework to try to work out try and generate the right type of behaviours and the right types of plantings. And I think it can be as detailed as you'd like, really. So hopefully that helps to answer that question.
Yeah. Julian, can you unmute yourself? And yeah.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Emma, thank you. Speaking from a developer perspective, I know taking the side of the developer must be a rather unpopular position here as anywhere. But I would worry that, I mean, I accept the point that you can regulate, but there's an insurance question, I think, that is very real. Urban forest fires and so forth. I don't know if you've been up to Kalamunda or Roleystone and so forth, but there is a big and growing risk of urban forest fires. So if this were to be implemented, I would think that developers would need to be protected against potential lawsuits by owner-occupiers or even by tenants who lose their homes in the worst case as a result of an urban forest fire. And conversely, that people occupying, you're familiar with the cladding debate in the UK, for example, where if your property has a certain type of cladding, you can't get a mortgage on it. I can visualize an environment where if you have an enormous tree next to your property, you simply can't get a mortgage on it because of the risk that the tree will catch fire and fall on your property, and that would be disastrous. So I'm just urging some kind of insurance component to your thinking in order that those kinds of risks don't block the policy process when it comes to fruition.
No, it is a really good point. I think that there are more. It's more than just fire. It's limbs dropping. It's safety from that aspect. And I know that there are there's also that sort of maintenance cost issue where people have to pay to have pruning done to keep the trees managed, and there's leaf litter that goes into gutters. I mean, there are disservices and there are costs and responsibilities, and I actually think that there's a real opportunity introducing a scheme where everyone pays some money. I mean, in Los Angeles, which is one of the examples of the stormwater one, they generate $300 million a year from their stormwater fees, property taxes, and that some funding could then be used to address some of these issues and make it a bit less onerous on the private landowners, so that actually they could be applied almost as an incentive to, if you have a certain amount of trees that reach this level, you can opt into this scheme where you can be subsidised or have some support for that. So I do think there is an opportunity in that as well, but you're quite right, it is definitely a problem and an issue to be considered.
Yeah, maybe one last question from online. I think Consequently, if you can unmute yourself and just ask, or maybe.
I think what I am asking is related in a way to what Julian and Russ were asking. So you can hear me, right?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So in fact, I think it's very easy to think that more trees are good, but Julian mentioned a good example of why they might not be. And the first thing that made me think is about my old school, which I enjoyed because it had open spaces. You could see everything, mountains and so on. And 13 years ago, I went to visit and it was all covered in trees and I couldn't believe it. And that was the first trigger. Is more trees good? Do I want to live in a tree that looks like a jungle? So how much is what's the optimal level of tree cover?
It's a really interesting question, and I know Claire has recently come up with an answer on that in relation to parks, and there's some also suggestion that 56% is the plateau benefit for mental well-being. But all that aside, there's actually a much more complicated research behind all of that. What has been proposed, it's sort of a rule of thumb, and I think a lot of cities are adopting this, is the 30-300 rule, which is that you must be able to see 3 trees from every home, and you have 30% canopy coverage in a neighbourhood, and that every resident is 300 metres from a good quality park space or green space. So that is kind of being adopted by some cities, well, and a lot actually. So that's, and I think that's probably where Perth is going to go as well.
Yeah.
Okay, does that help?
Thank you.
It's exactly that question.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe
Yeah, there's not a lot of work on it because it's too complex. That rule of thumb seems to be picking up some momentum.
Okay, thank you. I think Dev, can you unmute and just ask you?
So Emma, that sort of rule of thumb is fine, but the other thing that Claire showed is that actually there isn't, focusing on a particular number like 30% isn't all that helpful, that actually the social net benefits is pretty unresponsive to changes. 20% is not that different to 40% or 30%, so that's just one quick comment. There's a heap of work funded by the CRC for water sensitive cities, including some legal governance stuff, but also sociology and economics that impinges in your space.
Yes.
Be worth chasing up, just sort of seeing what was produced. That's a centre that's finished now, but there'd be dozens of studies that they've produced on green infrastructure and for many different directions, including behaviour change. And then my other one is you've sort of put forward a specific mechanism, your create a fee and then offer discounts.
Yeah.
It just strikes me that there's a whole raft of mechanisms for promoting behaviour change. You could list a dozen of them without even thinking, and that's one very specific one.
Yes.
I put a comment in with some other ones, but some of those mechanisms people in the school have worked on in the department already in different, maybe not in exactly this context.
Okay.
But in some cases in this context, like Claire and Curtis's work on social norms and network effects within urban areas in promoting trees or redevelopment of verges, for example.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of other comments as well, so maybe come and have a chat.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, if I can build on work that's been done here already, that would be awesome. And I'm very conscious that there are a myriad of other ways of addressing it. And part of the initial work that I do on that third component will be to take a good look at what they might be. So I've picked this one out as an example because it seems to be leading the way in the US, but absolutely, I want to explore other things, and I really hope to give another presentation at that point so that I can get some quality feedback on what and why I've decided to look at. So
even if you end up looking most closely at just one, it would be good to have a sort of a sense of what the other options are and put them.
Absolutely, and that's why I think really need to look at regulation in that broad sense of, well, what ways can we influence human behaviour here, and even just picking up off the ways people already behave and where there are good voluntary programs, that sort of thing as well. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Dave.